Good evening, my friends. Thank you for coming once again under the gentle glow of the moon. Here, you can pause, relax, and simply listen. Feel free to leave a comment about what you enjoyed. I read everything. Make yourselves comfortable. Ahead lies a quiet story. And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new nocturnal tales. Enjoy your listening. The night in the winter steppe always seems longer. But when a work train enters it, the night stretches even further, turning into an endless corridor of darkness outside the windows. The train moves slowly, almost by touch, and through the thin, trembling glass panes, only the gray-black snow flying horizontally can be seen, as if the entire steppe has decided to move along with the wheels. Inside, the heat from the stove is thick and uneven, and people who sleep right in their work clothes, not removing their boots, are covered by quilted jackets and padded coats. Beneath them are wooden bunk beds, above which creaking shelves hang, and the entire carriage, soaked in coal dust and machine oil, seems less like a train and more like a long bar on iron wheels. They fall asleep not because night has fallen, but because their bodies give up. The rhythm of the train's clattering, which becomes a kind of lullaby, rough, heavy, yet strangely echoing, lulls them into sleep. As the train moves, time begins to blur. There is no evening, no midnight, no dawn. Only the transitions between stations, where the train nearly never stops, and this constant shift of darkness outside and the hum of wheels creates a night that feels endless. A strip of time where a person lives as if in a dream, but without truly sleeping. The work train does not need rest. It embodies movement itself. That's why those inside live in a state where sleep is never fully theirs. It is shared with the road, with the locomotive, with the stove that can die out if someone doesn't wake up in time to stoke the coal. People know that if the train stays still too long, the carriage cools rapidly, and sleep turns into a fight for warmth. And if the train keeps moving, the jostling, vibrations, and rattling of the couplings prevent any long-lasting forgetfulness. Sleep here isn't silence, but trembling. It isn't rest, but a brief slipping into semi-consciousness when the mind still hears the road. Outside the windows, the steppe is empty and lightless, seeming to stare directly into the carriage. In such moments, everyone feels small. The work train is a point in the vast night, and only the stove inside whispers that life persists here. People sleep in groups, side by side, feeling the warmth of each other. Still, the night feels foreign. Along the corridor, someone moves quietly to avoid waking others. Someone coughs. Someone shifts on the creaking bunk. All of this blends with the rhythm of the wheels, which seem to beat the pulse of an entire era. An era when roads were built not by machines, but by hands. An era when work didn't end with the shift, but continued on the move. When night wasn't a time for rest, but simply another segment of the journey. And the question naturally arises, how did those whose lives unfolded within a moving home manage to sleep? How could they rest where the walls trembled, the floors vibrated, the air smelled of coal, and the night outside had no beginning or end? How did they find strength when sleep was just as arduous as work during the day? From this point begins the story of the nights of work trains. Nights when a person learned to sleep not in opposition to the road, but together with it. When discussing the work trains of the industrialization era, people often picture only a carriage with people and a stove. But behind this image stood a vast country, which moved its builders just as it transported materials or equipment. Welcome to Lectures Under the Moon with Daniel Hayes, where we explore stories of resilience and history. Inside these trains lived the people who built the railroads, drilled the mines, laid communication lines, erected supports, and tunneled through swamps, steppes, taiga, and rocky ridges. These were the assemblers who could put together a bridge in freezing wind, the track layers, for whom night and day were indistinguishable. Only the locomotive's headlamp marked the boundary between work shift and journey. The signalman, stretching wires along the tracks, sometimes under a snowstorm, sometimes in rain. The drillers, whose hands were constantly trembling from the vibration of the pneumatic hammer. The miners, whose faces always seemed smeared with dirt even when they slept above in the wagons. The heated rail cars filled with crews became small worlds of their own, lacking streets, walls, or real doors, only thin planks, metal, and the moving air. These workers rarely returned home. The country was growing rapidly, and its construction projects moved along with them. Work trains could travel for months along the newly laid track, moving from site to site, changing stops like nomads, but never turning back. The workers lived where they were dropped off, and slept where night overtook them. Sometimes in the wagons, sometimes in tents, but more often in those very heated cars many called home. In such conditions, personal space vanished completely. Sleep became a collective act. One person turns over, the bunks creak. Another coughs, waking a neighbor. Someone came back late from patrol, and the whole wagon hears the footsteps. People lived within arm's reach of each other, breathing the same air, sharing the warmth of the stove and space as if they were a single organism. The psychology of work train crews was shaped not by schools or instructions, but by life itself. The harshness was not in the pose, but in the protection it offered from fatigue. Restraint was not a character trait, but a survival mechanism in a collective where any word could ignite conflict. Fatigue made people silent. Sleep was brief. And in this world, an unspoken code of the profession was born. Sleep meant when the body fell. No one argued with it, because for most workers, their body was the only gauge of time. They fell asleep as soon as they could, without expectation, preparation, or rituals. On the floor, on shelves, on bags, on tools, anywhere. The main thing was that the stove stayed lit and the door not blown shut by the snow. Work trains were filled with people of different ages and backgrounds. Former peasants, young men who had fled the village seeking work, seasoned veterans who knew every sound of the rail, former prisoners who found in hard labor both silence and a chance to live without walls. Volunteers eager to build the country the way others built houses. In one wagon, there could be people from 4 different regions, 4 different temperaments, 4 different fates. Yet at night, they all transformed into one community, where no one was truly alone. That was the most important rule. Someone always had to be nearby. Not just for warmth, although that was part of it, but because it was safer that way. Workers knew that if someone slept alone, they might drift into a deep sleep, risking danger. But if they slept close, someone would always hear if the temperature started falling, if the stove trembled, if the train's vibrations changed, if smoke began to seep out, or if something else happened. Collectiveness was not an ideology. It was a way to stay on one's feet. That's how the character of the workers on these trains was formed. Slightly tough, slightly reserved, but remarkably resilient. They could sleep for weeks on the shelves beneath the wheels, with no time for longing or complaints. Loneliness simply didn't exist. It dissolved into the hum of the road. Fatigue became a shared state among the workers. Sleep turned into a brief but essential burst. Survival. It was these people who raised the bridges, laid the rails, dug the mines, and built the lines, placing supports across steppes and swamps, pushing the country forward. Kilometer after kilometer, night after night, sleep after sleep. Each new stretch of track began with someone on the train opening their eyes and getting back to work. The world of industrialization was a special one. A vast nation stretched for thousands of miles, and for the first time, Steam locomotives became the force capable of piercing through it, with rails connecting cities, carving a path into places that once only echoed with silence. It was an era when the land transformed faster than people could grasp the changes. Bridges arched over rivers, embankments rose across wetlands. Tons of steel vanished into the plains, and all this happened not near towns, but far away, in empty spaces, where stations could be built after years, and homes might not appear at all. Workers' trains became the only way to live amid these transformations. They replaced houses, roofs, rooms, kitchens, streets, and neighbors, all at once. During the night, the industrial epoch seemed especially powerful. Locomotive smoke hovered in the air, blending seamlessly with the earth. Thin columns of steam stretched upward into the frost-lit moonlight, giving the impression that the rails themselves were breathing. Cold, heavy, as if the metal itself stored the memory of the day. The stations where workers' trains made brief stops were almost always dark. A couple of kerosene lamps cast weak light, a wooden shed served as a signal hut, a coal barge floated nearby, and snow-covered platforms sat empty, with no one waiting. At night, such places felt disconnected from civilization. Instead, they appeared as tiny islands of light amid the wilderness. Roads stretched across vast emptiness, where human footprints almost never lingered. The long stretches between stations could last for hours, or even half a day, and workers knew that outside the window might be a steppe, taiga, swamp, or rocky cliffs. Anything but human voices. At night, the rails rang clearer than in the daytime. The wind carried the sound, as if the road was reaching straight into the sky. Those living aboard these trains heard this noise as part of their very existence. The clatter of rails meant you were moving. When it stopped, it was time to get out and work, sleep, or wait. The process of industrialization carried with it a restless sense of romance, felt only by those who spent months aboard such trains. Everything around smelled of metal, coal, and cold iron. The thick, warm scent of kerosene lamps mixed with the dampness of wet clothing. When the train halted, in the dark fields, the only sounds were the cooling of the locomotive, the crackling of metal, and the occasional exhalation of steam. These sounds formed the background for the workers, just as much as the winds howling or the crunch of snow. That era moved to a different rhythm. There was no rush, only constant motion. No comfort, only the absolute necessity of living right on the move. Even the railways themselves were unfinished. Many sections were still under construction, and workers' trains traveled along temporary tracks that had to be inspected every night. Crossings over rivers were often fragile, narrow, and the embankments damp. Sometimes a train would stop in a clear field because there was no track beyond. Waiting was necessary until the next team laid down another 20 meters of rail. In such conditions, trains became tiny fortresses on wheels. Each carriage was like a separate room in a large, constantly moving house. During the day, the surroundings buzzed with people, noise, work, commands. But at night, only darkness reigned. Drafts, sparse footsteps on the planks, and the metallic clang of couplings. Sometimes a conductor or a brigadier would walk through the train, and other times no one would appear. At those moments, it felt as if the train moved on its own, like a living creature that did not need a person. The atmosphere of industrialization at night was filled with a sense of transience. Everything was temporary: stations, tracks, houses, and people. Yet it was this very impermanence that held the country together. Workers slept to the rhythm of construction sounds. Far off, the hammering echoed across the horizon, and somewhere stones exploded in the process of breaking. On a nearby branch, an empty wagon with tools clattered, its rhythmic knock becoming the lullaby of an era, the nighttime cradle of this epoch. Trains were always cold. Even when the stove was burning, the corners of the car remained icy, and the walls were covered with frost. A thin layer of dust, sand, coal crumbs, and sometimes snow, blown in by the previous shift, lay scattered across the floor. People slept wrapped in whatever they could find: overcoats, quilted jackets, blankets. When the train moved, the air inside the car vibrated faintly. So too did the night, becoming part of the road itself. The world of industrialization created a special feeling, a sense of smallness, yet necessity. The road seemed endless but obedient, dark yet not empty. It was full of sounds that pushed you onward. Worker trains thrived on this sensation, as if the night moved by itself and the people inside were merely passengers in a vast, unstoppable process. It was a time when the country was reconstructing itself, and people learned to sleep under the clatter of wheels, the wind's whisper, and the flickering lights of rare stations, trusting the road more than their own home walls. During the industrial age, a worker's train was not just a set of wagons, it was a home that moved on its own. A long, wooden and metal barrack on wheels, where each carriage had its own purpose, smell, habits, and even character. Those who lived in such trains for months knew. If the train started moving again, it meant their home was moving. If it stopped, it was time for the day to begin, and waiting for warmth was pointless. Inside, everything was so cramped and tough that it sometimes seemed the trains were built not for people, but for the road itself, and the people just tried to adapt. The most vital was the Teplyushka wagon, the heart and bedroom of the iron home. A long wooden box soaked with smoke, soot, and dampness. Bunks ran along the walls, 2 or 3 tiers high, made from rough, unpolished planks that creaked with every movement. Over the bunks, ropes were stretched, on which clothes dried, while beneath them there were boxes with tools that were never fully closed. The Teplyushka smelled of iron, heated stoves, coal smoke, kerosene spilled around, and damp gloves. Each worker had a small corner, something to support the back, a tin mug, a knife, a flask, and sometimes a photograph tucked between the planks. But all of this was only temporary. The moment the train jerked to a sudden stop, the order was shattered. Things fell over, tools clanged, and the floor became slippery with coal dust. The stove, round and black, with a pipe always too short, stood at the center. It could be either too hot or not enough. In the morning, the wagon was icy. By evening, it was unbearably hot, making it hard to breathe. They used it to heat tea, dry gloves, or sometimes cook if the kitchen wagon was too far away or already in use. Around the stove, people always gathered, not out of a desire to chat, but just to warm their faces and hands. Yet the warmth dispersed instantly. Just a few steps away, the air turned cold, as if the wagon was a giant pipe through which the wind was constantly blowing. The kitchen wagons were a world apart. There, the smell of hot porridge, soups, and fried onions mingled with the scent of grease, kerosene, and damp wood. Everything within them spoke of warmth, though it was fleeting, and as soon as one moved away, the air became icy again, the wagon transforming into a tunnel through which the cold wind endlessly passed. In these wagons, the firemen and the cook hardly slept, because the workers returned in shifts, each waiting at least for a hot bowl of food. The tables were simple planks, and there were large kettles that they kept on the stove day and night, knives tied with ropes to prevent losing them during the jolts of the train. Bags of grains hung from the ceiling, and on the shelves there were cans of stewed meat, sometimes bread, sometimes salt. This was a place where people didn't just eat. They kept silent, exchanged brief remarks, and sought warmth. The night kitchen was the warmest corner in the entire train. There were wagons with baths, a rare luxury, a miracle. Inside a large kettle, a stove, wooden shelves, and basins of hot water. But more often, baths were arranged right inside the heated carriage itself. All the gaps were sealed, stones were sprinkled with water, heads wrapped in towels, as if trying to momentarily reclaim their human state. This bath was not for pleasure, but purely to shake off fatigue from the bones. After it, sleep was different. It was as if the body remembered that it was alive. Beyond that, there were the wagon repair shops, heavy, noisy, filled with iron. Hammers struck, pliers rang out, sparks fell to the floor, and the air was thick with the smell of oil, machine grease, dust, and iron shavings. Here, tools were repaired, drills sharpened, rails reinforced, chains and hooks mended. This wagon was like a continuous day. Even at night, it sometimes couldn't quiet down. Repairs couldn't wait. The tool car was the neatest, most oddly organized part of the train amidst the chaos. Shelves held nails, bolts, ropes, boxes with adjustable wrenches, spools of wire, axes, crowbars. Everything was labeled, everything carefully arranged, but still in constant motion. As soon as the train moved, each impact of the wheels produced a gentle ringing, as if the wagon was whispering to the track. The fuel wagon was a heap of coal, barrels of kerosene, firewood, and tarps. The smell of fuel seeped into clothes, hair, and hands. This wagon was loud, heavy, dusty, but absolutely vital. Without it, the train would become a cold, lifeless shell in the steppe. Altogether, the work train resembled a long, stretched-out house, where each door led not just into a room, but into another way of surviving. The space was shared, the noise cold was shared, the food was shared, and the night was shared. One wagon might hold sleeping people, another boiling water, in a third, a hammer pounding, in a fourth, a stove humming. All these activities happened simultaneously, in a rhythm dictated by the road. The work trains rarely stopped, sometimes for a day, sometimes two, with no pause. The wheels rolled, couplings trembled, walls vibrated. People lived in this constant motion as if it were the breath of the very era. They didn't ask if it was comfortable or if there was another way. They simply accepted it. Inside the train, life thrived, but there was no personal space. Disorder, smells, noise, closeness, all mixed together. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to go, nowhere to be alone. Yet many recalled these trains as their true home, because here were comrades, work, warmth from the stove, and the rhythmic pounding of the rails that made falling asleep easier than in any quiet room. The train was a home that never stood still, a home that lived by the laws of the road, a home where night never stopped but kept rolling forward, further and further into the darkness, toward the next station, the next task, the next day. The winter worker's wagon obeyed its own rules, and those rules became especially clear at night when the train disappeared farther into the steppe or taiga, and inside the heated carriage, a world of its own arose. A world where warmth and cold formed a strange alliance. Near the stove, it was warm. It was so hot that people took off their hats, unbuttoned their collars, and stretched their arms toward the fire, trying to warm their fingers, which had grown stiff after work. But just a single step to the side would cause the temperature to change suddenly, almost without warning. The air beneath the lower bunks was icy, like a frozen cellar, while the upper bunks only held a faint wave of warmth seeping through the cracks between the planks. It was impossible to heat the entire wagon. It remained too large, too drafty, too restless to hold in the heat. Only the center, the circle around the stove, stayed warm, like an illuminated island in the midst of an icy expanse, while everything else sank into cold. The cold would return every time the coal burned a little faster than desired. On the walls, a thin layer of frost formed, delicate as ash, silvery and almost invisible at first, then growing quickly. It melted in spots from the breath of the workers, but after an hour, it covered the boards again, transforming the wagon into a wooden freezer. The windows trembled from the vibrations of the wheels and the shifting temperatures. Sometimes it seemed they were ringing softly, almost imperceptibly, but persistently, as if the winter wind outside was trying to seep in and was breaking against a thin film of ice. The smell inside the winter wagon was a unique mixture, impossible to confuse with anything else. The scent of coal was heavy, dense, and pungent, blending with the smell of wet clothes hanging over the stove, with the aroma of fuel oil soaked into the floors, and the scent of old wood that had stored warmth and dampness through countless nights. Sometimes a faint odor of dried mittens was noticeable. Sometimes the sour smell of spilled kerosene, and occasionally a light bitterness from the fumes of the stove. When someone entered such a wagon after being outside in the cold, it was as if they stepped into a thick, warm fog, sometimes unpleasant, but familiar enough to become part of the night. The sounds made this space almost alive. Water, melted from clothes, dripped somewhere in the corner, forming dark patches on the floor. The stove hissed, sometimes steadily, sometimes nervously, as if trying to say that its heat was eternal. Deep beneath the wagon, dull, rhythmic knocks echoed. The wheels rolled over the joints with a steady, endless sound, as if the rails themselves were humming a lullaby. Occasionally the boards crackled, something fell inside the tool car, or a short metallic clang was heard. The wagon seemed to shudder, responding to the cold or the unevenness of the track. These sounds weren't frightening. They were part of life, part of the night, part of the cold train. Yet, in the silence between the knocking and the hissing, there was a feeling that the wagon was not merely a machine, but a living organism, breathing, warming, enduring, and moving along with the people. At night, the winter wagon became a long, vibrating room where every worker felt himself a small part of the collective warmth. Those lying closer to the stove warmed up faster, but woke from the heat. Those sleeping near the walls wrapped themselves in 2 or 3 jackets and still felt the icy drafts slipping through the cracks. Sometimes someone got up to toss in more coal, or turned over on the creaky bunks, or quietly cursed as they nudged a neighbor's leg. But most often, the night merged into a shared, heavy, yet strangely soothing rhythm. Wheel beats, the hiss of the stove, the breathing of the workers, the creak of the wood, and the steady rolling of the wheels. And so it continued until dawn. In such conditions, sleep was neither deep nor peaceful. But the winter wagon lived, warmed, accepted, and sustained as best as it could. And as long as the icy wind howled outside, inside the heated car, the night persisted in its fragile existence, binding all the workers into one moving home where warmth was maintained by effort and life was attentive to every sound. Preparing for the night aboard the work train was not merely a habit, it was a true ritual of survival that each worker performed automatically, even when pushed to the very limit. After a shift, when everyone returned to the wagon tent, a specific sequence of movements would begin, almost like a choreography honed over years. The first step was the clothes. All garments, soaked through with sweat, snow, oil, dirt, and grime, were hung up to dry. Over the stove, horizontal bars were suspended, on which gloves, undershirts, mittens, and shirts swung and swayed. The steam was so thick it often seemed as if the entire wagon was breathing. Every worker looked for a place to store their belongings. The closer to the stove, the better, yet too close was dangerous, risking a fire or scorching the fabric. A quiet struggle unfolded between the men, a silent tug-of-war for precious centimeters, with no shouting or arguing, just a subtle, almost invisible shifting of gear closer to the heat. The second part of the ritual centered on the stove itself. The stove was both a deity and a foe, a savior and a potential killer. It had to be tended with care, careful enough not to suffocate from carbon monoxide, yet gentle enough to keep the coals burning through the night. One person would tend the fire in the evening, another would take over during the night, and a third before dawn. They would add coal, adjust dampers, listen intently to how the stove responded to the draft, to the cold air, to the wind. The stove was always crowded, some warming their hands, others drying their boots, and some trying to heat a can of stewed meat. Here, workers discussed the day, exchanged insults, laughed, or remained silent. Everything was near the warmth, without which the wagon would become an icy box. Meanwhile, the tools used during the day were carefully stowed away. Crowbars, shovels, saws, wrenches, all the implements needed for work had to be stored so they wouldn't clang loudly during the train's braking or risk hitting someone's head. Tools were placed beneath the lower bunks, strapped with belts or tucked into corners. Sometimes a worker would find a broken wrench and grumble, while others would check if their hammer was still alive. This was a small but essential evening ritual, a reminder that work would start again tomorrow. As night fell, the workers would turn their attention to the wagon itself, treating it like a home. They would inspect the windows to ensure they weren't rattling too much or letting in drafts. Gaps were stuffed with rags, newspapers, or scraps of burlap. The door was reinforced with plywood or planks to block out the cold. Drafts were the true enemy, pulling heat out of the wagon so quickly it seemed as if an invisible door had opened. Everyone understood that even the slightest breeze could turn sleep into a torment. Later, the process known as tidying up the bunks began. The term sounded loud, but in reality it was a simple task. Shaking out blankets or cloths, adjusting the straw bedding, arranging their bed with old overcoats, blankets, and jackets. Yet this act held profound meaning. The way a worker prepared their spot revealed who was stronger and who was weaker. The more experienced workers would claim the corners free of drafts. New arrivals tried not to complain and accepted whatever was left. Inside the heated wagon, a silent, unwritten social map existed. A quiet code understood by all. When the stove was roaring, when clothes crackled as they dried, when tools were neatly stored and bunks prepared, a brief but vital transition occurred. A moment of silence. The workers, who just hours earlier had been shouting over the noise of machinery, gradually lowered their voices. Fatigue pressed down so heavily that thoughts grew heavy like cold briquettes. Some preferred to remain silent, sitting by the stove and gazing into the flames, as if they could see another place within the fire. Warm, peaceful, far removed from this endless journey. In that quiet, the relentless rhythm of movement slowed, and the night settled into a fragile, shared stillness, binding everyone together in a common effort to survive the cold and exhaustion. If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe to Lectures Under the Moon. Some workers needed to write a few words home on a torn piece of notebook paper by the light of a dim oil lamp. Others rummaged through their pockets for nuts, lockpicks, small parts, as if clutching a tangible fragment of familiar reality. Preparation for the night didn't end when everything was arranged. It concluded only when a person had accepted it deep inside. Today, he sleeps again in the wagon, hears the wind outside the wall once more, feels life continuing forward along with the train. And while the stove breathes steadily with its warm glow and the rails beat out their endless rhythm, in the heated carriage, that special night unfolds. Neither dark nor frightening, but working. A night sustained by small human rituals, without which neither cold nor the long journey could be endured. Warmth in the workers' trains wasn't simply acquired. It was fought for, guarded, saved, as if it were the most precious resource of the entire industrial age. In winter, the freight car transformed into a space where every glowing head, every spark from the stove, every scrap of heat mattered. Everything the workers did before sleep was aimed at one goal: to keep the warmth going just a little longer than the night allowed. The main source of heat was the stove, a metal furnace with thin walls, usually placed in the middle of the wagon. It heated up quickly, but cooled just as fast. The workers carefully added coal, trying to stretch their supply until morning. Too much coal meant it would be too hot for a moment, then the fuel would run out, and the wagon would turn into a frozen box. Too little, and it would become an icy prison. The stove rested on a metal sheet, with coals, iron bars, and charred firewood scattered around it, remnants that helped keep the fire alive. Each shift worker had his own way of stoking the fire. One liked to nearly close the damper completely. Another left it open just enough to fit the palm of a hand. A third could almost tell by ear how much coal was needed to keep the stove burning evenly. The heat radiated only within 2 meters of the stove. The rest of the wagon lived in its own microclimate: cold floors, drafts along the walls, icy moisture by the door. To somewhat even out the temperature, the workers used small tricks, the most famous being heated stones. They placed smooth, round stones on the stove, which retained warmth for hours. When heated, they wrapped the stones in old shirts, quilted vests, or sacks, and laid them under the bunks or at the feet of sleepers. Sometimes they would put a stone directly into a boot, making sure the footwear was a bit warmer in the morning. This warmth didn't heat the wagon, but targeted the people precisely, carefully. Sometimes, workers laid stones along the handles of metal tools so the metal wouldn't freeze and become brittle. The second way to create warmth was by sharing blankets. 2 or 3 workers would lie under a large cover or an old army poncho. This way, they kept more heat among themselves, which determined whether they would wake up shivering in the night or manage to sleep 20 or 30 minutes straight. Sleeping curled up was impossible. The space was too tight. But a pair or a trio of comrades would fold into a bundle, sharing their warmth. The older men taught the younger ones a simple rule: if you want to survive, don't separate. Warmth was collective, and no one saw it as a sign of weakness. In conditions of 30-degree below zero temperatures inside a metal wagon, which cooled faster than words could reach a neighbor's ear, human warmth was the most reliable defense. Clothing was also part of the thermal strategy. They slept without undressing, putting on everything dry they had. Felt boots stayed on their feet to prevent freezing from below. They placed blankets over their shoulders, tucked woolen cloth or layered coats under their backs. Some even laid empty sacks underneath themselves to add insulation. Even loose fabric offered some protection against the cold surface beneath. The key skill was in properly distributing one's warmth. It was essential not to let sweat accumulate, to avoid freezing later. One had to avoid covering oneself too tightly to prevent suffocation from the fumes, yet not stay too exposed so the cold wouldn't seep through the seams of the clothing. There was also a small secret: the back. It was always protected with particular care. People would tuck in closed boxes, wooden shields, thick rolled-up clothing, anything that could block the piercing air coming through the metal walls of the wagon. When the stove was burning steadily, the workers would lie so that the heat beam ran along their bodies, but without scorching them. The intense heat was treacherous. It made people sweat, and sweating in the night meant guaranteed freezing. Men learned to maintain a delicate balance, warming up without overheating, retaining heat without losing it to moisture. Sometimes they even created warmth using tools. Hammers, saws, wrenches were placed near the stove so that in the morning metal parts wouldn't burn their hands. There were instances when workers used old, worn-out wagon parts as small heat absorbers. They would heat them up and place them at their feet among the pile of belongings or in a corner. Everything was useful. But the most important thing was that warmth was not merely physical. It was collective. In the evenings, when everyone gathered around the stove, it seemed that the wagon grew a little warmer simply from the presence of people, from their tired voices, from someone laughing and recalling home, from that pervasive feeling, we are here together. That was what made the nights bearable. That was what kept the heat alive where metal, coal, and felt were weak. In the workers' train, warmth wasn't just a daily necessity. It was a valued resource, treated with respect, care, and almost reverence. Sleeping on the workers' train did not mean resting. It was more like passing time. Sleep here was not comfort or recovery. It was a small pause between exertions, a brief fall into silence that the train would quickly shatter with its ringing, jolts, and vibrations. Workers slept in short bursts, 20, 30, 40 minutes at most, rarely longer. These weren't full hours of sleep, but fragments scattered throughout the night, streaks of fatigue on which the body clung simply because there was no other choice. Many couldn't even remember exactly when they had fallen asleep. Sleep came in sudden jolts, as if someone had turned off an internal switch. Yet it would also end just as abruptly. The wagon jolted, the stove clanged, someone bumped into the frame, a draft or a restless neighbor woke someone up. In the industrialization trains, the night was never one continuous stretch. It was broken into countless pieces, each one a fragment that a person tried to grasp and hold on to. The sleeping position was a separate science. Most couldn't fully lie down. The low bunks, cramped space, and constant cold from below forced them to choose a semi-sitting posture, with their back pressed against the wall or a rolled-up quilted coat. It was uncomfortable and not physiologically ideal, but otherwise the spine would freeze, making it impossible to straighten in the morning. The warmth tended to flow downward. That cold from below was the greatest enemy. Workers looked for a position where their legs wouldn't rest on the bare floor, their shoulders wouldn't touch the metal wall, and their chests wouldn't be chilled by drafts. They would sleep with their legs drawn up, curled in a way that minimized heat loss. Younger workers often tried to sleep lying down, but experienced men had long realized that the curled-up pose was the only reliable one. Comfort was part of their routine. The train moved with its complex mechanical rhythm. The wheels clattered, the couplings groaned as they pulled the train, the stove hissed, the glass vibrated, and the ceiling echoed with metallic sounds. Any noise could signal something important, an arrival, a malfunction, danger, or a command. Therefore, they slept as if their hearing was not entirely turned off. People had learned to wake up instantly the moment the train began to slow down, or, conversely, to accelerate. It wasn't anxiety. It was habit. The body listened to the rails as attentively as an ear listens to a voice. The train became a vast living creature, next to which a person slept, yet never forgot its presence for a single moment. The vibration of movement acted like a kind of metronome. It didn't lull, but maintained the rhythm. When the train moved smoothly, with a gentle, steady hum, the workers could sleep a little longer, because the rail tremor balanced their breathing, slowed internal noise, and allowed the body to grasp at least some sense of deep rest. But if the train changed speed, the noise became sharper, the wheels hit differently, the vibration shattered, and sleep evaporated in an instant. Many would say, It's not I who wake up, but the train itself. And in that, there was truth. The person adapted to the iron rhythm, as if becoming part of a giant mechanism. Sleeping alongside others was the norm. In the cold wagon, 2 or 3 men would lie closer, not out of friendship, but out of necessity. Another's warmth was not awkward. It was part of the collective safety. The bunks were wide, but space was still tight, so they slept shoulder to shoulder, sometimes with knees pressed against a stranger's back, sometimes almost crawling over each other when the cold seeped in especially fiercely. In such moments, no one even thought about moving away. Everyone understood that the warmth of another body helped preserve their own. Personal space completely disappeared, but the night wagon was not a place for privacy. Survival depended on sharing warmth. The sensation of sleep in this environment was unique. Heavy blankets soaked with time, scent of coal dust and old wool. Rough fabric, prickly but life-saving. Rigid bunks that only spring under the weight of the body. Damp floors, walls covered in frost, and the constant sound of movement. Mechanical, rhythmic, alien. On nights like these, it seemed that a person was not sleeping in the wagon, but in the journey itself, that sleep was simply part of the path, as much a tool of work as a pickaxe, shovel, or drill. The attitude towards sleep was straightforward. It was not rest. It was an unpleasant state of losing strength, a necessity that, in itself, did not restore power. Sleep offered no comfort, no sense of security. It was more like turning off the engine so it wouldn't burn out. Every awakening brought the same fatigue as at the moment of falling asleep. But without those short moments of sleep, a person simply could not withstand the rhythm of industrialization. The workers knew they had to sleep, not because they wanted to, but because without these brief immersions, the body would stop obeying, hands would cease to work, and thoughts would start to fall apart. That is why sleep on working trains was a special state, a mixture of necessity, habit, exhaustion, and internal discipline. People didn't sleep for themselves. They slept so that in the morning they could go out again into the cold, to the construction site, to the tools, to the heavy earth, to work that waited for no one. The idea of sleeping enough simply did not exist. There was only one idea: to manage to fall asleep before the noisy, relentless clatter of the iron train started again. Night in the working train did not arrive instantly. It spread through the wagons like thick smoke, filling every crack, settling on rough bunks, on the warm stove, on wet felt boots placed against the wall. When conversations faded and people sank into their short, fragmented dreams, the train came alive in its own way. It was a quiet, mechanical, heavy life. A life of movement, where a person was merely a passenger in the fate and circumstances shaping him. At first, the sound of the rails beneath the wagon was heard, steady, measured, almost meditative. The rails did not clang. They cracked like dry branches under heavy footsteps. Every joint responded with a gentle jolt, causing the top bunk to tremble slightly and a mug on the table to sway. The flame of the kerosene lamp flickered faintly, barely noticeable. This cracking was not irritating. It was part of the night itself. It replaced the wind, the sound of the river, any natural noises that vanished under the roar of the steel road. The workers grew accustomed to falling asleep to it, as if under a lullaby sung not by anyone, but understood by all. Occasionally, the train would change its rhythm, and in the wagon a periodic tapping of the buffers could be heard. These deep, muffled strikes, as if someone heavy was pounding on the hull with a broad palm, made even those who had long since learned to sleep seated startle. The blows were slow, irregular, yet they signaled one thing. The train was adjusting its pull, distributing tension across the cars. The workers could tell from these sounds whether the train was climbing, descending, or passing through a difficult stretch. Even in sleep, they sensed the difference. The slight dip as the train slid down a slope, or conversely, the tension when the wheels worked as if going uphill. The wooden walls of the wagons had their own life. They creaked, softly but constantly, becoming a permanent companion of the night. Old planks, soaked with cold, oil, and moisture, responded to every movement of the train. A slight shift in the formation made the wall exhale. Changes in the wind caused the creaking to rise in pitch and volume. The cold intensified. The wood cracked as if someone had stepped on a dry twig. This creak seemed to mark the passage of time. In a working train, it was impossible to tell how many minutes had passed because every sound was the same, like time was dissolving into the rhythm of wood and metal. Near the stove, which always hissed even when the fire was nearly out, a low rumble persisted, like a steady growling. It was not menacing. Rather, it was a noise that gave the sense that a small piece of warmth was alive inside the unheated wagon. The rumble was uneven, rising and falling as if the stove was talking to itself. The air near it was softer, warmer, moving gently, but in the corners of the wagon, where people slept on the upper bunks, the cold remained harsh and piercing, demanding the body to move and find some warmth. Distant rustlings of the sleepers, turning over on the bunks, formed a separate kind of music. Someone pulled up their blanket, another shifted position, still others searched for a comfortable posture. The wooden boards responded to every movement like worn-out instruments. Sometimes a cough escaped, sometimes a groan, not from pain, but from the fatigue that only reveals itself in the dark. These sounds were intimate, yet no one felt embarrassed by them. Life in such a wagon erased the boundaries between the people. The night made everyone equal. Some fell asleep, others woke briefly, and some stared into the darkness under the ceiling, thinking about the next day. Somewhere far ahead, sometimes just faintly audible, a dull howling of the steam engine rose. Quiet, not frightening, more like a long, steady, confident moan. That was the voice of the road, whispering, "The train is moving. Everything is in motion. The night has not stopped." The howling could be lower or higher, depending on the wind, the cold, the weight of the train. It was a reminder that somewhere ahead, the engineers, also awake, listening to the metal, were guiding the entire convoy, while the workers in the heated cabooses tried to grab their precious, short moments of sleep. The glow of the kerosene lamp was a character of its own, separate from the night. He trembled on the ceiling, creating the illusion that the carriage was slowly drifting through a sea of shadows and light. The lamp never burned evenly. Its flame flickered in rhythm with the movement, making the walls come alive. Shadows from the shelves, boots, and tools seemed to breathe, stretching, bending, twisting as if they were alive. Without metaphors for breathing, only the visual rhythm persisted. That flickering light was the only comfort inside the carriage. It softened the night, even if just for a moment. It allowed a person to feel that the world wasn't entirely cold. And, most importantly, it created the illusion that the night was longer than the road, stretching not in hours, but in kilometers. That time was no longer measured by minutes. Instead, it was gauged by the sound of wheels, the clatter of buffers, the hissing of the stove, and the occasional sighs of sleeping workers. The night on the working train became a space, not just a span of time. It seemed as if the train wasn't moving forward. It was passing through the night, threading between its layers like through a dense fog. And lying on his stiff cot, hearing the lamp tremble and the rails crack, he understood he was not alone. He was part of a vast mechanism that never fully slept, and in this rhythmic, mechanical night, there was room for a strange, silent, heavy calmness. The night aboard the working train was never a time of rest. It was a time when everything that could still be controlled during the day was merely endured at night. Men who spent months in heated cars knew that the most dangerous moment was not when the train sped across the icy steppe, but when it stopped, because movement kept the heating and vibration gave the illusion of life, and a stop amid winter could be deadly. The first danger was freezing during a halt, especially if at that moment the stove went out or the coals in it nearly burned out. When the locomotive moved forward for maneuvering, or when the train was halted during a transfer for technical reasons, and the wagon was left in darkness without supervision, the temperature inside plummeted instantly. Cold did not creep in gradually. It descended from above and below at once. The wooden walls, which just minutes earlier retained some residual warmth, began to creak as if someone was striking them with a metal rod. The air turned into a thin, icy dust that cut to the bones. People would wake up almost simultaneously. No one called, no one woke anyone up. Simply the body sensed the change in temperature as an alarm. If they managed to stoke the stove in time, the night might end with frostbite, or workers failing to get up in the morning at all. But an idle stove was a danger in itself. Fires from the iron stove, ignited at midnight, were not uncommon. It was enough to leave the damper slightly open, let the coals burn out, or brush against the heated pipe with a coat or a blanket, and the entire wagon could burst into a hellish blaze. The dry wood, soaked in dust and kerosene, ignited instantly. The heated compartment became a trap, cramped, low-ceilinged, packed with people, with only one door that could be sealed shut by frost. At night, fire was twice as terrifying. Half the people were still sleeping. The rest, awakened, didn't immediately understand what was happening. Fog, smoke, flames, screams, all of it blending into chaos. Rescue was not always possible. Many kept a damp cloth under their pillows, a strange habit, but it could give a chance to breathe through the smoke and reach the exit. There was also the technical danger on the track. Those working on the rails knew that the railway sometimes changed character during the night. Frost could break the coupling. Steel became brittle and fragile, cracking as if bent by hand. It happened without warning. First a small jolt, then a sudden jolt, and the wagon would start to sway on its own, breaking free from the main train. Workers would jump up suddenly, grabbing tools and supplies from the wall as they felt the wagon shake like a boat torn loose on the waves. There were times when the wheels would come off the rails entirely, simply because the snow on the track grew too thick, and the sleepers beneath it would freeze and start to shift under the weight. In those moments, the wagon would veer off to one side, begin to tilt, and the people inside would press themselves to the floor, waiting for the blow, the first and most decisive strike that would decide whether they would live or not. But machinery wasn't the only threat. During the industrial era, work trains often passed through remote, deserted areas where, at night, anyone could be encountered. Attacks by bandits were not just legends, but a part of everyday life. The trains knew that in certain regions it was better not to stop in the dark. Those who hunted the railway workers would steal food, tools, clothing, and sometimes take lives. The fear of these night visitors was that they came silently. An worker would wake up when the door of the heated carriage barely creaked, and within seconds, he would see the silhouette of a figure that was definitely not one of their crew. Sometimes it ended with screams, fights, and injuries. Other times, things simply disappeared. Belongings, or on rare occasions, people. And in the morning, no one asked what had happened. The train would move on, and the night would erase the traces. Yet the strangest, most heavy, and most mysterious danger of all was a feeling that defied words, an almost mystical sense that the train lives at night. A tired man lying on the top bunks could feel the wagon breathing without actually breathing, with an internal motion that seemed to come from within the walls. They would creak on their own, sway without reason, and thud as if someone was walking over the roof. Sometimes it felt as though the train itself chose when to accelerate, when to slow down, when to scare those inside. People understood that at night it was best not to stare too long into a dark corner. It would seem as if a shadow there was stirring. They knew not to listen too carefully to the creaks, lest they hear footsteps that weren't there. They learned not to pay close attention to the sound of the wheels, because it would begin to form words. The life of the train was not a fantasy. In conditions of cold, fatigue, isolation, and endless roads, the human mind easily started to add sounds that weren't really there. But the workers accepted this calmly. They would say, "The train itself carries the night." That was a reminder that at night, it was better not to argue with the sounds or try to find logic in them. Instead, they would lie down, warm beside the heat of another's shoulder, listening to the journey and waiting for dawn. Because dawn was always a test. Had they managed to survive another night on the iron road? The night trains of the industrial age were not just work vehicles. They were worlds where people lived, people who could sleep where they might freeze to death, work where every effort was felt in their bones, and keep silent in a way that was louder than any words. And in this nocturnal world, stories are born. Stories that were not recorded in reports, not published in newspapers, not told to the authorities. But it's these stories that reveal what the people of the working railway truly were. One such story was about a man named Klim, a mechanic, broad-shouldered, always covered in grease, yet with eyes that looked straight ahead without hesitation. Klim always slept sitting up. He would sit on the edge of the lower bunks, leaning his back against the wall, clutching his helmet to his chest as if it were a talisman, and fall asleep for 20 minutes, 40, sometimes an hour. His colleagues would laugh. "Are you afraid to lie down?" He would answer calmly, "If I lie down, I'll freeze." And that was no exaggeration. He knew that in the coldest corner of the wagon, the bunks would draw in cold from below so fiercely that even the strongest could catch a chill. But sitting allowed him to keep warm. He could rest his chest against the helmet, hide his hands inside his jacket, and hold his body longer that way. One night, the train stopped at a siding. The glass instantly froze over, and the stove went out. Those who were sleeping lying down woke up trembling from the cold. Klim was not there. He simply opened his eyes and said, "The stove is still alive," and he lit it on the first try. There was also talk of a woman cook from the dining car named Maria Dmitrievna. Short and sturdy, with hands that could knead dough and lift a bucket of boiling water with one hand. She knew every worker by their step. Even at night, when the train rocked and the wind roared against the metal shell, when sleep pulled at their minds, if someone quietly passed by the kitchen, Maria Dmitrievna could say, "That's Pantaleev. His left boot squeaks louder." Or, "That's Semyon. He's tired today. His steps are shorter." She knew people better than they knew themselves, and it was said that one night she sensed footsteps that shouldn't have been there. Soft, muffled steps. She grabbed a kerosene lamp, stepped outside, and saw a figure by the door of the cattle car. She called out, "He vanished!" In the morning, they found footprints near the train. The bandit had left upon seeing the light. Everyone understood that if Maria Dmitrievna hadn't heard, things could have turned out differently. Among the workers was a man named Yegor. Quiet, unobtrusive, always on the sidelines. At night, he did something that even seasoned track workers found frightening. He listened to the tapping. Lying on his bunk, with his eyes closed, he sensed every strike, every ringing of the metal coupling, every irregularity in the rhythm. By the sound, he could tell where a rail had a tiny crack, where the sleepers had warped from frost, or where the train was struggling too heavily. He simply said, "The metal is singing." People laughed, but one night he lifted the entire wagon in the middle of the night, claiming the track ahead sounded wrong. The conductors checked, and indeed found a crack in the rail at one section. The train was stopped. If Yegor had kept silent, the train might have come off the rails within an hour. There was also a story about a wagon that once turned into an icy box. It happened on the far northern section, where the frost reached 50 degrees below zero and the wind tore through the steppe like a blade. That night, the stove went out and the coal ran out. Within 10 minutes, the walls were coated with ice. Icicles hung from the ceiling, instantly turning into sharp spears. The passengers sat pressed against each other, their legs wrapped in old jackets, faces hidden by their hands. They said nothing. Talking was too hard. The steam immediately settled and froze on their lips. At dawn, when the train reached the station and warmth was restored, the wagon looked as if it had been frozen from the inside out. Matte, brittle, with frost on every surface. That night, no one slept. They had simply endured it. There were also stories about nights when the stove was dying, and people fought, literally, for warmth. A stove that couldn't withstand fatigue, a worker with trembling hands from the cold who dropped his tongs, or 3 men arguing over who would go outside for coal, and one who went out and froze in 2 minutes, but managed to carry the bag back. These stories were passed on like legends, told without many words, because everyone knew the stove was life itself. As long as it burned, the wagon was alive. When it went out, the night had decided to test everyone anew. Fights around the stove were also part of the long night journey. People exhausted, angry from the cold, each with their own wounds, their own resentments. Sometimes, in the dark, someone would shove a neighbor or argue over a tool, not out of friendship, but because the work demanded collective effort. No one wanted to pull a rail next to someone they hated. On the road, resentment melted away like frost near the stove. Slowly, but inevitably. There was also a loner, a man who never slept at night when the train passed through the taiga. He sat by the window, staring into the darkness. It was said that once his train derailed and he lost his family. Others said he simply was afraid. It was said that he heard something in the forest that others could not hear. He never explained. He simply sat silently while others slept. If someone got up during the night, they might see his silhouette, motionless like a statue, with eyes fixed on the dark woods beyond. And at night, the train seemed smaller than his gaze. Of course, there were legends. Workers always told stories about ghostly figures on the railways, about a man in a cloak walking along the roofs of cars at stops, about a red light flickering in the steppe. If that light moved beside the train, it was a sign that the locomotive was about to break down. There were tales of footsteps on the track when the train was standing still. Steps without a person. And once, someone saw a face in the window, pale, wearing a conductor's cap, but the carriage was empty. People knew that fatigue could make the imagination come alive. Yet legends persisted because the night on a work train was a place where reality and shadows could very easily switch places. All these stories about character, about the men who slept on iron, beneath icy walls, amidst noise, clatter and cold, yet did not break. For them, the night was not an enemy. It was simply another stretch of the journey they had to pass. Night shifts on industrial-era trains were considered a man's world. Rough, noisy, heavy, soaked with coal dust, grease, and exhaustion. But within that world, women were always present, though few. Yet they created a delicate space of human warmth that kept the trains from turning into endless cold barracks on wheels. Their role was rarely acknowledged in official records, but it was women who kept the nights on these work trains more stable and peaceful. Among the passengers were laundresses, cooks, nurses, and sometimes engineers, just as resilient as men, only with a different kind of inner strength. Their day was no less arduous. Water for washing froze in buckets, the stove in the dining car demanded constant attention, and tools for fabric processing or bandaging often fell to the floor with every jolt of the train. But night was a different challenge altogether. Women did not have separate compartments of their own. Most often, they slept in the corner of the kitchen car near the stove, or in a small infirmary compartment, where they stored bandages and medicines. That corner was not warm. The stove's heat only reached in one direction. Beyond that, cold seeped in. Under the floor, through the gaps, into the space between crates. Yet that small corner was theirs, tiny, cramped, but theirs. The only quiet refuge on a train full of the loud breathing of sleeping men and the metallic sighs of wheels. Night, for women on work trains, rarely meant sleep. Their rest was more like a short, cautious silence, easily broken by any sound. Sometimes they dozed sitting up, leaning against the wall or a table, clutching a scarf or a cup to hold in warmth. But most often, they did not sleep at all. Someone had to stay awake. The stove couldn't be left unattended. It might go out, or worse, ignite the wall nearby. Water for the morning porridge had to be heated well before dawn. An injured worker needed a fresh bandage. A teenage recruit, on his first expedition, needed an extra blanket. Their night was not a time of rest, but a long, warm watch over those sleeping around them. Their resilience was unique. Men relied on habit and toughness, while women drew strength from inner calm that required no loud words. They did not complain, nor did they demand separate quarters. They simply understood that if they allowed themselves to show weakness now, the entire train's order could collapse overnight. So they remained steady and silent, like the faint glow of a lamp that does not hurt the eyes, but makes the carriage feel alive. And still, when a rare moment of silence would come, the women slept more deeply than anyone else. Their sleep resembled dissolution, a warm scarf against their cheek, the faint glow of the stove, footsteps in the corridor, a moving train somewhere far inside. It was not a sleep for rest, but for preservation of oneself. A small pause before the next day, which always began earlier for them than for everyone else. The men often didn't notice that the women didn't sleep at night. But when in the morning the carriage was warm, the water boiled, and someone in the corner smiled even slightly, everyone understood. The night had passed more easily than it might have, because in the train, there was a woman who held it on her quiet shoulders. Although industrialization's work trains are often seen as a man's world, filled with coal dust, exhaustion, and heavy labor, some carriages carried families. They weren't always accepted, but such cases were frequent. Northern construction projects lasted for months, and men, unwilling to leave their wives and children behind, took them along. Thus, in the harsh reality on wheels, small islands of life appeared. Children's voices, toys made from pieces of wood, tiny boots by the stove. Children's places were wherever they could find space to exist. Most often, they were on the upper bunks, next to toolboxes, homemade chests, or bundles of ropes. For a child, the top bunk was not just a bed, but also a lookout point, and the only place where they could hide from the roar of adult conversations. In the darkness, the train became a living creature for them. It shook, made noise, and breathed with a rhythmic clatter of metal. And that rhythm became the first lullaby of their lives, rough but strangely calming. The children's nighttime fears were unique. They didn't fear monsters under the bed. They feared stopping, silence. When the wheels suddenly ceased their clattering, the carriage seemed to hold its breath, and the child would wake, not understanding what had happened. They were afraid of the squeal of couplings, the cry of an adult searching in the dark for a tool, the slam of a door, the whistling wind slipping through gaps and playing on the tin walls. But nearby were their mothers, whose warm hands could turn this harsh sound of the road into a story. A fairy tale about a train traveling through the night to build something important. The children listened, pressed close to furry collars or woolen blankets. Feeling the vibration through the entire bunk, they often fell asleep, dreaming of how the rails stretched beyond the horizon, how snow shimmered under the glow of a lantern, how workers built a path where there had been nothing before. In this way, their own memories formed. The scent of coal and hot stove, the yellow glow of a kerosene lamp, the soft rustle of their parents' clothes. All of this became part of their childhood, just like the smell of fresh bread at home or the squeak of a wooden floor. And the most astonishing thing, despite the cold, noise, and cramped space, was that children on these trains usually slept the deepest of all. Perhaps because the adult world around them shielded them as if behind a wall, maybe because the movement gave a sense of continuity, as if the night itself carried them to where warmth awaited. Or perhaps because the journey became their first true memory of the world, harsh, trembling, metallic, yet full of life. These children later remembered not the toil, not the fatigue, nor the heavy conversations. They remembered the sound of wheels, that very rhythm they learned to fall asleep to, the rhythm that remained in them forever as the music of an era where the road was home. Morning on a work train does not come suddenly. It does not burst in with light like in ordinary houses, nor does it wake people with gentle sounds. Morning here arrives slowly, creeping through a layer of frost that has grown on the glass overnight, seeping into every crack and corner. It drifts in with the thick smell of coal, which is soaked into the entire carriage through the sleepy, heavy footsteps of those who have spent the night shivering, unable to find warmth. At first, a faint gray glow appears, not so much light as a suggestion of it. It softly spills onto the walls, the frosted window frames, and the upper shelves, transforming the train into a dim, icy corridor. It might seem that night should retreat, but it lingers nearby, clinging to the cold of the floor, the dampness of clothing, and the breath of those rising, as if they are still moving forward in a dream. The first sound of morning is not a voice or a step, but the movement of the stove. Someone among the most persistent has already gotten up and is trying to rekindle the small stove, shifting the coals, tossing in small pieces of wood, tapping on the door that is contracted from the cold overnight. The stove responds with weak sighs, a metallic groan, and gradually, very slowly, the air around begins to warm. Yet, it's impossible to heat the entire carriage. The warmth only rises around the stove, leaving the distant corners as icy as they were in the night. People wake up and immediately understand where they will be spending the day, near the warmth or along the wall. The footsteps in the corridor become the second sign of morning. They are heavy, uncertain, as if the legs are still searching for a rhythm. Someone moves toward the door to look outside. Has the frost thickened? Is it snowing more? Is the train still standing, or has it already started moving? Others carry buckets, search for cups, or try to loosen their frozen felt boots, which have become so stiff they must be warmed by hand. At this moment, the carriage comes alive. Not quickly, but inexorably. Voices emerge, coughs, yawns, short commands. Everyone knows that morning is not a time to rest, but the start of another long, hard day. The smell of soup or porridge drifts from the kitchen car before the people arrive there. It is a dense, heavy aroma of simple food, not meant for flavor, but to keep people on their feet. The hot line forms quickly. Some stand silently. Others grumble softly. Some smile. It's a rare morning luxury. The food warms hands, fills stomachs, and restores a sense that another day can be survived. After breakfast, the ritual of preparation begins. Tools are laid out, belts are tightened, axes, crowbars, wrenches, and drills are checked. Fatigue still lingers. It remains in the muscles, shoulders, and back, forcing each person to push themselves to keep moving. But the work train does not wait, and the road does not pause. The engineers are already warming up the locomotive. The sound of steam pushing through the cylinders, metal beginning to come alive, can be heard. Through the window, frost covers the landscape, rails glittering, distant stations barely waking up. Yet, there is a brief, almost imperceptible moment when people line up to exit or disperse into the cars. Someone glances back toward the place where they just slept. The bunks are now empty, blankets rolled up, the stove hissing softly, and the light has grown brighter. That moment feels like a reminder. The night has passed. Whatever it was, anxious, cold, creaking, it is now behind. The train moves forward once more. Life continues, and ahead lies a new cycle of work, a new stretch of track, another night that must also be endured. The train on wheels has become a symbol of the age of industrialization, an era when the country grew not by kilometers, but through the efforts of those traveling to places where there were no roads, no houses, no lights. Worker trains carried not only laborers, but also hope, fatigue, and a future being built right on the rails. In these carriages, cities were born, construction projects began, and destinies were decided. Night in a working carriage was just a small part of a vast journey, one that connected people with one another across endless miles. Close together we slept and warmed ourselves by the stove, sharing bread and listening to the same rhythmic clatter of the rails, which seemed like the heartbeat of the entire era. Anyone who managed to fall asleep amidst this noise, this cold, this cramped space, and endure even one such night, was already part of a vast country that wouldn't stop for one person. Sleep here was not rest, but a lesson in resilience, solidarity, and trust. A lesson that together we can survive the cold, the darkness, and the endless road. May your night be as steady as the rhythm of old rails, and as warm as the stove in the worker's carriage. Thank you for watching Lectures Under the Moon. Please like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more stories.